In the 1930s, as the nation was reeling from the Great Depression, the federal government implemented a program to help struggling Americans with their mortgages so that they could avoid foreclosure. The Homeowners Loan Corporation sent its people out to appraise homes and neighborhoods to determine value and so-called detrimental factors that would inform which homes lenders would want to insure. Now, as it turns out, to lenders, being black alone was a, quote, detrimental factor. Inadequate federal policies made way for lenders to refuse to insure mortgages in or even near predominantly black neighborhoods. This phenomenon became known as redlining. The policies of the 1930s provided subsidies for developers to build suburban communities and subdivisions while allowing them to be available only to white people. It effectively forced segregation, preventing black Americans from owning property and forcing many into public housing projects. Black Americans have faced more than just redlining, though. Racial covenants, urban renewal, blockbusting, predatory mortgage lending, and illegally inflated property tax assessment. Each of these phenomena stagnated or worsened inequality and prevented upward mobility for non-white people. When USC law professor Bernadette Atuahene moved to Detroit to continue her study of black property ownership and the systemic patterns that steal land from black Americans, she was immediately faced with the city's foreclosure crisis. She found that thousands and thousands of homes in Detroit, particularly those owned by black people, were under foreclosure. And when she dug into why so many of those homes were actually in despair and under foreclosure, she found its insidious roots. Lower income homeowners were being taxed on their properties at wildly inflated rates. A study by the Detroit News and the Center for Investigative Reporting found that the city of Detroit overtaxed residents by a cumulative $600 million between 2012 and 2017. Those insurmountable, heavily inflated tax bills led to the foreclosure of more than 100,000 homes, many of them black households, which made up more than 40% of Detroit's population, were the ones that were most heavily impacted. And even the homes not facing foreclosure found other untenable challenges. The professor's years of research and reporting in Detroit and beyond that led her to her new book titled Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Home Ownership in America, which is going to be released next month. In it, she writes, quote, "For decades, redlining deprived homeowners of access to home repair loans and other capital. Then, during the Great Recession, predatory mortgage loans and the accompanying mortgage foreclosure crisis decreased home values in the same redline areas even further. Consequently, the home repairs exceeded the home's value, leaving these homeowners' children and grandchildren to inherit money pits instead of assets, further undermining intergenerational wealth. After a cost-benefit analysis, many walked away from their ramshackled patrimonies." And Bernadette joins me now. I am so excited about this work and so glad that you're here. Your book begins with two men, two black former sharecroppers from South Carolina and one white former sharecropper from Italy. Both of these men moved with their families to Detroit in Michigan looking for work at the Ford factory, but from there, everything goes differently and that impacts their family for generations. Can you talk to us about this story?
Absolutely. So neither grandfather had an easy life. And the book goes through how racist policies affected the Black grandfather's ability to pass along wealth to his grandchildren, while the Italian grandfather and his descendants were allowed to thrive. The racist policies I'm talking about include racially restrictive covenants, redlining, blockbusting, urban renewal, predatory mortgage lending, and most recently, inequitable property taxation, which we can talk about in a minute. And I call these racist policies because they're written and unwritten laws and processes that produce or sustain racial inequity. Racist policies exist regardless of intentions. So although my book Plundered begins with Detroit and the Ford Motor Company, it's not just about Detroit. It's a national story about how racist policies undermine Black homeownership in America.
There are two things that you said that I think are so critical. One is this notion of the transfer of generational wealth, which is not something that people really appreciate the significance of. But then also this notion that both of them started out, and it wasn't easy for 80 of them. And that's partially because when we have these conversations, oftentimes people who are not black are quick to say, well, my family didn't have it easy. And so when you merge those two things and then you incorporate the notion of policy being a barrier, it really does help to explain why our struggles, in fact, are not the same. Given that, explain to me the practice of predatory governance. How does that work, and what is its impact specifically on Black Americans?
Yeah, and so predatory governance is a concept that I create in this book to talk about instances like the property tax foreclosure crisis in Detroit. So let me use kind of the story of Myrisha in my book to really illustrate this concept of predatory governance. So in 2008, Myrisha inherited her grandfather, Grandpa Brown's home, which was dilapidated due to redlining and other racist policies that systematically deprived majority Black neighborhoods of valuable investment. Then city officials overvalued and overtaxed the homes in Detroit, leading to historic levels of property tax foreclosure. Since 2009, 1 in 3 homes have completed the property tax foreclosure process. We have not seen this number of property tax foreclosures in American history since the Great Depression. So what in the world is going on? One of my studies found that between 2009 and 2015, in each of these 7 years, the city of Detroit inflated the value of 53 to 84% of its homes in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. The lowest valued homes, like Myrisha's inheritance, got hit the hardest. So this is really a quintessential example of predatory governance, which is when local governments basically illegally, they overtax, they charge Black people more because, and again, their intention is not important, but the point is these funds go into the public treasury. So we do a lot of talking about corruption, right? But no matter what definition of corruption, whether it's the World Bank, IMF, Transparency International, it's always for private gain. This concept of predatory governance really opens a conversation about when it's not an individual, but it's the state treasury itself that's benefiting from these racist policies. And again, the story of the property tax inequity in Detroit is a quintessential example of predatory governance.
So excited to check out Plundered as soon as it drops. Thank you, Professor Bernadette Atuahene, for being here on Velshi.